Hey, sports fans! New York Parrot has come out with a great new show for you guys, Sports with Rich. Broadcast time 10 p.m. Tuesday evening. Rich Mancuso with Robert Rizzo as a co-host. Sports with Rich is captivating, informative, and entertaining, and it will pertain to all American sports such as soccer, football, basketball, baseball, athletics, wrestling, you name it. Get rich information from Rich Mancuso on Sports with Rich. Parrot TV, the voice for humanity.
Hello. Thanks for joining us at the Foreign Policy Review today. I'll be hosting in place of Dustin Pickering, and our guest today is from the Oriental Despot. It's Jay Tharappel, and our topic will be imperialism. And I'm going to turn it over to Jay to give us a little bit of background, or Bob, if give us a little bit of background about himself, a little biographical text.
Carlo, thank you very much for introducing the show today. So I would like to, before Jay gets on, I would just like to thank him for being on our show. He's in Australia right now, and it's super early in the morning. It's a very inconvenient time, but he has been kind enough to join us. He's a PhD student. He's done a lot of great research and written a lot of great articles on, current events. Today, we're going to talk about imperialism. Recently, Jay has written a tremendous article about imperialism, and it's very relevant to today. I would like to, have Jay do a little self-introduction, and then we can get into the conversation about imperialism and some, those relevant matters. So, Jay, please tell us a little bit about yourself, and thanks again for being on our show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. Yes, it is. It's 2 a.m. in the morning, so I went to sleep and I woke up again, but I'm happy to be here to talk about this topic. Yes, I am a PhD student. I'm on the verge of submitting. But my main interest is imperialism. That's what I'm writing about. I'm reconceptualizing the concept. But that's not the only thing that I write about. I've been writing about the war in Yemen for quite a while. I wrote an article for the Cradle, and before that, I think I really started to cut my teeth in geopolitics with the start of the Syrian war back in the early 2010s. So that's a little bit about me. What would you like to know? Where would you like me to start?
So let's discuss, imperialism, and, there's a basic understanding on the left. Most of the self-identified left, especially in the West, I think agrees with Lenin's definition of it. And, he wrote, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. And there was about 5 points that he used to define an imperialist country. So it was very relevant in 1917, and I think maybe the relevance has changed some. And I have my own opinions, but we're here to hear your thoughts about that. So can you tell us more about your perspective on those 5 points that Lenin documented in 1917?
Sure. So the 5 points are the concentration of production and capital, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, the export of capital as opposed to the export of just commodities. Then there's the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations and the territorial division of the world. And so the conventional way that most Marxists proceed upon understanding imperialism is by applying that criteria. So, for example, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists, which is an organization that I have a great deal of respect for, they put out an article which said a country can only be classified as imperialist if it really meets all of the criteria laid out so carefully by Lenin over a century ago. and that to be an imperialist power, it is not sufficient just to engage in international trade or to have a meaningful defense capacity. It is not trade, but a reliance on the super profits brought in through the export of capital by monopolist financiers that indicates that an economy is moving from the lower stage of capitalism to the higher monopolist stage, which is imperialism. And so I'm quoting directly from the CPG BML there. To the uninitiated, this only raises the question, what's the purpose of that criteria? So clearly, I think we can begin with the most obvious fact, which is that imperialism and the word imperialist, they're pejorative terms. They denote something that should be opposed. And the question is why? And I argue that there's two different versions of what Lenin meant by imperialism. But both of them are bad things. It's just that they're contradictory in the following way, but they're not so contradictory that they can't be reconciled. I think that our task is to reconcile them. So the first version is the pamphlet he wrote during World War I, which is Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. This is the text that everyone knows. The second version is the one that's less well known. It's the definition of imperialism that you find in his speech to the Comintern after World War I, and that appears in the report of the Commission on the National and the Colonial Questions. That was in 1920. So I'm going to begin with the 1916 pamphlet. Lenin was attempting to mobilize the working classes, particularly of Europe, against the First World War that they were being conscripted to fight in. And he was making the argument that they should use the opportunity to carry out socialist revolutions against their respective capitalist ruling classes, which would not only end the war, but also end the underlying cause of the war, namely capitalist class rule within the various warring empires. So according to Lenin, as capitalist states develop, the industries within them, they form monopolies, and then these monopolies are further subordinated to banks, resulting in much larger financial oligarchies that command large sums of capital. And then these states are bursting at the seams with capital. They are then compelled to violently acquire territory so they can export that capital, which is where the impetus to war comes from, until eventually these states clash with each other, which is what leads to war, or World War I, which is the war that Lenin was witnessing. And this is a conception of history that was borrowed by Lenin from John Hobson. John Hobson wrote a book called Imperialism, a Study back in 1902, which argued that the export of capital ran contrary to the interests of the British working class. And so the argument that he's making is that the British working class has an interest in opposing British financial capitalists investing overseas rather than investing it at home. However, the nations subjugated by Britain for the purposes of extracting their wealth did not feature in Hobson's argument. So Hobson's argument was that this imperialist export of capital would be unnecessary if wealth were more evenly distributed within Britain. And he argued that, if the consuming public in this country raised its standard of consumption to keep pace with every rise of productive powers, then there would be no excess of goods or capital clamorous to use imperialism in order to find markets. So similarly, Lenin argued exactly the same thing. He said, quote, surplus capital will be utilized not for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country, for this would mean a decline in profits for the capitalists, but for the purpose of increasing profits by exporting capital abroad to the backward countries. In other words, capital exports are treated as a solution to the problem of underconsumption or overproduction, for that matter. Shall I keep going, or did you want to ask a question?
No, that's a great, concise, easy to follow explanation. And so, yeah, definitely keep going.
Okay. So what I'm saying here is that this particular conceptualization of imperialism, it has to be understood within the context of Lenin attempting to convince the working classes of the various empires that were fighting each other in World War I that imperialism was against their interests. However, this was not Lenin's last word on imperialism, because after the revolution, after World War I, Lenin essentially redefined imperialism as national exploitation, which is the word that I give for it, because I'm using the term national exploitation as opposed to class exploitation. So in 1920, at the Second Congress of the Comintern, Lenin declared that the characteristic feature of imperialism consists in the whole world being divided into a large number of oppressed nations and an insignificant number of oppressor nations, and that about 70% of the world's population belong to the oppressed nations. This is a direct quote from Lenin. And this is in clear reference to those nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America that were historically colonized for the purposes of extracting their wealth. So this just raises the question, how did the oppressor nations exploit the oppressed nations? Now, here's the contradiction. The answer could not have been via the export of capital. Okay, this is the contradiction that I highlight. And that's because the export of capital represents the grievances of the working class against the financial capitalist class inside the capital exporting oppressor nation, originally England, or Britain rather, because it comes from the Hobsonian or John Hobson's conception of the world. So according to Lenin, this is like where I point to what Lenin is saying in 1917 in the definition that everyone knows, to point out why the answer could not have been via the export of capital. So according to Lenin, the export of capital influences and greatly accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported, and may tend to a certain extent to arrest development in the capital exporting countries. Now, if this is the economic mechanism underpinning imperialism, then it implicitly rules out even the possibility of national exploitation, given that backward countries, to quote Lenin, are being spurred into industrial development by externally originating capital, that too at the economic expense of the capital exporting imperialist state or oppressor nation. Does that make sense? It's a bit complicated. It's not. I don't think anyone else has made this argument or made this observation. But please,
yeah, I'm not sure that I follow that, but I would like to. Perhaps we can bring it to the present by making a distinction between the way China goes about its international business, that is the Belt and Road Initiative, and the way the United States goes about its business,
sure,
which is AFRICOM and the militarization, the offering of essentially of security contracts with the rest of the world, which they can then use to stage coups and that sort of thing. How do you see that distinction?
Sure. So China is actually the leading capital exporter in the world, which has actually contributed to the accusation that China is imperialist. So how do you respond to that? You know, like Lenin, 1917, is talking about capital exports as being a defining feature of imperialism. And here you have China as the leading capital exporter in the world. My response to that is to point out that the leading capital exporter in the world when Lenin was writing his 1917 text was Britain. And the countries to which Britain exported capital were countries like Australia, Canada, the United States, Germany. These countries imported capital from Britain, and they developed, they industrialized as a result of receiving that capital from Britain. The oppression, the national exploitation or oppression that Britain engaged in against other countries was not by exporting capital to them. Actually, what happened is that Britain plundered countries like India through taxation. There was the slave trade that went on from 1500 to 1850 in North America. And there's also the indemnities that were imposed on the people of China. This is how national exploitation actually takes place. And it's through this process of wealth extraction by Britain that Britain was able to back the value of its currency and then export capital. So by exporting capital, Britain was doing exactly what Lenin was saying. You know, Britain was it was greatly accelerating the development of capitalism in those countries to which it was exported, and to a certain extent arresting development in the capital exporting countries, which is why John Hobson was against the export of capital, because he thought that it was against the interests of the British working class to invest overseas rather than investing at home. It's the same attitude that you see among Donald Trump voters, you know, which is the opposition to the United States investing overseas rather than investing at home, and running down manufacturing at home, right? It's the same kind of mentality of the working class perspective within the capital exporting country. Now, as for the way that the United States operates, I mean, the US used to be a capital exporting country up until about 1985, at which point the United States started to become a net capital importing country up until from 1985 onwards. Again, I don't think it was the US exporting capital at all that made it imperialist. So from 1945 to 1985, when the US was exporting capital, what was it doing? In many cases, it was building up countries. So the United States export of capital to China was aiding the industrialization of China. Was that imperialist against China? No, China developed, China industrialized as a result. The reason why the US invested in China to begin with was because after 1971, the US needed a country to back the value of the US dollar with their own labor. And that's what the Chinese did. The Chinese produced in exchange for the US dollar, worked very, very hard to churn out these export surpluses. And now China is the supply depot of humanity. That is not the essence of US imperialism. The essence of US imperialism is that after 1945, the US pursued a global geostrategy of trying to keep the rest of the world poor. They tried to keep Russia and the post-colonial world poor for as long as possible. And this is something that you see in the writing of George Kennan. So George Kennan was the architect of the U.S. containment strategy against the Soviet Union and the architect of the U.S. strategy in the Cold War more generally. And according to him, quote, he's talking about the United States. He says, quote, "We have 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity." Okay? Maintain this position of disparity.
NSC 68. NSC 68.
1948.
It was NSC 68, yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. I didn't know that there was a name for the document, but I'm glad that you know about it, Carlo. I mean, that for me essentially summarizes US imperialism, because if you're going to define imperialism by Lenin's last word on the topic, then he's talking about national exploitation. He's talking about oppressed nations versus oppressor nations. So how do nations oppress other nations in the economic sense? And the way that the US did it is through the US dollar. So the US dollar entails this free lunch in the sense that the United States is the only country in the world that's able to run up the debts and the deficits that it does. And that's because the rest of the world continues to accept US dollars. Now, the question for the US is, how does it maintain the use of dollars? How does it maintain this demand for US dollars? Well, I remember there was an interesting book that was written by an IMF economist by the name of Ishwara Prasad. And he said, quote, this is quote, "It is striking that so far, amid all the trade wars, geopolitical tensions, and economic and political recriminations against the US, foreign central banks in aggregate have been net purchasers of US Treasury securities." He then says, quote, "Geopolitical tensions," end quote, that they appear to cause a strengthening of the US dollar. Okay, so he's saying in another speech, he says that, I'll rephrase that. Although Prasad does not acknowledge any causal relationship between the US financial system and US military power, he uses the phrase, quote, "protection money" to refer to the purchase of US dollar assets, which is curious because that phrase is also a euphemism for extortion. So he says, quote, "There's so much turmoil that countries around the world seem willing to pay this huge price, that is buying US dollar denominated assets in order to protect themselves," end quote. In other words, he acknowledges that turmoil around the world is good for US dollar hegemony because of the influx of protection money. So if the US destabilizes Syria, then it causes an influx of buying US dollars. If it destabilizes Libya, the same thing happens. When the US destabilizes other countries, it props up the US dollar. Okay. Now, I would much rather have a conversation about how that is imperialist, because that actually does reinforce the US dollar. And reinforcing the US dollar is a way of exporting inflation to other countries. So imperialism is not the export of capital, it's the export of inflation. It always has been. when Britain was plundering India, the way that Britain plundered India was that they gained control over the system of taxation, and they used 1/3 of the taxes raised from the Indian population to buy goods from India, which is a one-way transfer of wealth. Well, that's a way of exporting inflation to India, and having a cheap influx of raw materials from India, which is what Britain was able to do in order to back the value of its currency, and then export capital to countries like Australia to build up this country, right? So I hope that makes sense.
So
yeah, go ahead, Billy Bob.
That's a great analysis. Essentially, you're saying that the defining feature of imperialism is not the export of capital, and I've always found that problematic too. And I've engaged in discussions because I believe Nigeria exports capital, but to call Nigeria imperialist is just absurd. So
and the biggest,
I like that.
The biggest importer of capital is now the United States.
Right, and so they're the opposite of imperialists, right?
Yes,
with our military installations in 75% of the world's countries, we're the opposite of imperialists. So no, I think I think that it's been such a travesty among the left to take Lenin's 5 points from 1917 and over 100 years later think that they are the most relevant and most applicable to our current geopolitical situation. It's absurd and it's problematic, and I'm really happy that you are addressing that issue, because it is a big one. And there's so much China bashing on the left, and they're so confused. So this is an important discussion, and I'm glad you're here to discuss with us.
The Chinese export of capital to countries in Africa is more closely similar to the British export of capital to Australia than it is to the British conquest and subjugation of India, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And to speak more generically, it's no coincidence that any country that threatens to get off the petrodollar, such as Iraq or Iran or Libya, pays a price.
Yes.
I was on a Somaliland television program, did an interview, and the subject of Berbera came up. This may relate to your work in Yemen. And in Berbera, they've got a deep water port and a huge airstrip now. And it was built ostensibly by the UAE, but the US had been behind it. And the part of the project went forward because they promised that there would be no military applications. And of course, after it was built, that completely changed. Now they're allowing the US to use the airstrip and the port, which is right across the Gulf of Aden from Yemen, as a kind of launching point. And Somaliland, which is seeking to be an independent country, has allied itself with the US, especially because they recognize Taiwan. And so my take on the whole show was, no, don't do that. Don't align with the United States. If you're going to align with anybody, align with China. For example, the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia is a magnificent project. And on the one hand, and I pointed out on the one hand, what you have in Berbera and Somaliland with the United States is just a security agreement. It's not a development agreement. And that seemed to me a profound distinction that the Somaliland elites were not getting. It was a kind of a get rich quick scheme among people in power in Somaliland, and that seems to me to be an important distinction between the way China goes about its business and the the U.S. goes about its business, and also. I read hundreds of comments by Africans from all over the continent about that distinction, and it was uniform. They were uniformly in favor of going with the Chinese, the rank and file people, the people on the ground, on the killing floor, who were commenting on these various articles, and it was virtually unanimous that it was the Chinese and not the U.S. that they preferred to have work with them for development. and it wasn't lost on them that all the U.S. wanted was the old traditional form of imperialism, extracting their resources. That was their perception, and so if you could elaborate on that.
The U.S. would much rather that China buy the U.S. Like just bought up American debt, so that's what like the United States would much rather happen, right? So like China, what does China do with its like large foreign exchange reserves? It can either invest in other countries around the world in mutually beneficial win-win trade, or it can do what it historically used to do, which is to finance the U.S. trade deficit, and to just lend more money to the United States. The United States would much rather the Chinese lent them money than lent money to countries around the world, so they can develop their own infrastructure and they don't have to go begging to the IMF. Because if you go to the IMF for a loan, because it's all voluntary, right? Like no one puts a gun to a country's head and says you have to borrow money from the IMF. Countries historically used to go to the IMF because there was no other major global creditor. It's either the IMF or it's the World Bank. And if you go to them for loans, you have to pay back those loans in US dollars. And on top of that, they demand all kinds of structural adjustment if you can't pay back the loans, which is why after the US, ended the gold standard and just started printing money, and because there was also the oil price hike as well, a lot of countries went into debt and they found it very hard to pay it off because they were paying for this much larger oil import bill as well. So they went into lots and lots of debt, and the IMF basically said, fine, you have to privatize and sell off your industries. You have to reduce public expenditure, which is really just a way of saying reduce the consumption of your own population. Because when these countries that go through structural adjustment programs, when they reduce their own consumption, it actually frees up more of their resources to be purchased by America, by the US dollar. And that keeps inflation under control in the US dollar. And that's the purpose. That's the intention.
Yeah, and that brings us to Ukraine. Ukraine, under U.S. tutelage after the Color Revolution in 2004, became the poorest country in Europe because of IMF borrowing and austerity programs. And Yanukovych's whole position was, look, we got to stop borrowing from the IMF. We cannot allow this Western package of IMF loans to go through because we're already at rock bottom economically. And so that's when the United States staged this coup with using Nazis as muscle to overthrow Yanukovych because they wanted to impose those IMF programs, which they did, and increase austerity, which impoverished Ukraine even more. My problem is that why can't people on the ground see what I see? I'm no one. I just read and a few things, and I can see what's going on with the U.S. I live in Washington, D.C., so I live in Satan's anus, so I understand that dimension of it. But I just don't understand people. I don't know why there would be a revolution, or not a revolution, but a coup against Yanukovych when it was just perfectly obvious. And I was talking to artists in Ukraine, and they weren't doing well. They weren't eating well. They understood their economic conditions, but they couldn't put two and two together. And they were all for the West, because that's where Andy Asshole came from, or Andy Warhol, and all this art that they were force fed by the CIA, as it turns out. It just I don't know. Maybe comment on that in general. It baffles me. People are so stupid.
Should I say something or? Billy?
Yeah, sure, if you want.
So I mean, I'd like to jump in. Sorry, Jay, if you had something to say, but no, I mean, So I think, Carlo is bringing up the idea of, propaganda and cultural propaganda. I mean, the West has won the culture war. During the Cold War, the West won the culture war, and they indoctrinated all the Eastern Europeans, a lot of them, maybe not all, maybe not even most, but enough of them to where they were celebrating the demise of the Soviet Union to an extent. And, Andrei Volchek wrote a great article about that. It's called like "We Sold Our Souls for Plastic Bags" or something, just talking about how, the youth had been conditioned to oppose socialism just because of the great music from the West and cultural things. But it's terrible. It's tragic that so many in Ukraine were advocating for the policies that were going to make their lives way worse than they already were.
Yeah.
And that's the magic of propaganda and the power of Western cultural propaganda, basically.
Yeah, I mean, let's look at this back in let's look at this in terms of U.S. geostrategy. I mean, I mentioned George Kennan earlier and his strategy of trying to keep, Russia and the post-colonial world weak. I mean, he was the architect of containment, which is this idea that you have to aggressively contain Russia, and that's what the point of NATO is. Like, people who get upset about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and say, well, Ukraine has the right to join NATO if it wants to. My immediate response is to say, well, what's the point of NATO? The point of NATO is to weaken Russia. It's to aggressively contain Russia. It's to make life hell for Russia. And so naturally, Russia sees that as a threat. And to understand what the purpose of NATO, I mean, we have to look at the overall strategy. There are countries that the US, after the Second World War, considered to be a part of their club. So that's Western Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada. So basically, the Anglo-American alliance, Western Europe, and Japan. These countries are broadly speaking within the American alliance. Plus there's also that so-called state in the Middle East with the blue and the white flag. I don't want to mention it for the sake of your channel. So the United States has essentially has to keep the rest of the world poor, and that's Russia and the post-colonial world. And so what they did was they essentially, bribed Western Europe after the Second World War. After Germany had inflicted so much damage against the Soviet Union, the US then proceeded to reindustrialize Germany and help Germany redevelop with the Marshall Plan. They helped Japan redevelop as well.
Jay,
Right?
can we take one quick break? I think the producer wants to cut to a commercial, and let's come right back and pick that up.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Hopefully he can take us to commercial. Otherwise, we'll just sit here looking at each other in silence.
Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you.
We're back. We'd like to hear more from Jay.
Sure.
Let's shoot on Jay.
Yeah, okay. So, the US has this strategy, right? There are certain countries that are in the club. And then the rest of the world has to just stay poor. The reason the US beat the Soviet Union in the Cold War is because the Soviet Union is actually doing much of what China is doing now, which is helping the third world. The Soviet Union had these trade relations with India, for example, where India could pay for Soviet oil in rupees. Didn't have to pay using rubles or US dollars. It could just pay in its own currency, and the Soviet Union would accept it. And with those rupees, they would buy Indian goods. So it was like a mutually beneficial trade. that helped India kind of industrialize throughout the post-war era. And the Soviet Union extended help to many countries. The Soviet Union supported national liberation struggles against colonialism. And so this is why the United States hated the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is essentially undermining the trade relations that had historically been established at the expense of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I mean, all of the countries that are a part of this elite club that the United States has constructed, which is the Anglo-American Alliance, Western Europe, and Japan. These are all countries that have a history of invading, colonizing, and subjugating Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So it's an alliance of former empires that are attempting to maintain their economic advantages with the countries that they had historically funded. That's what it is, essentially.
And now what we have is we have a rising China, where if the West doesn't do something, China is going to displace them, and it's going to displace their system, and it's going to put in place a system that China promotes as peace through mutual prosperity, win-win trade, and developing the underdeveloped world. I think the system the West put in place since 1945 has been predicated on keeping development from occurring, keeping the third world impoverished and exploitable, so they can exploit and extract all the wealth from Central America, South America, Africa, the Middle East, etc. So the U.S. clearly sees, if they don't do something as the leader of the West, the U.S. is like the headquarters for the Western capitalist dictatorship. If they don't do something, they're going to find themselves being displaced. So, they've got a problem, right? You got Russia, very powerful, up and coming. You got China, even more powerful, economically up and coming. So it seems that the strategy of the West is to first isolate, regime change, and balkanize Russia, and then they can do the same to China. That seems like the approach that they're currently taking. And Ukraine, of course, is the first manifestation of that strategy. Trump had a different strategy, and he was kind of kicked out, because it was contradictory to the capitalist class consensus. So he wanted to be friends with Russia and then isolate China. But that wasn't what the consensus was. The consensus was, no, we're not going to be friends with Russia. We're going to destroy, balkanize, overthrow Russia, and then we'll isolate China. So it seems like Trump's way probably would have been could have been more successful than what the West is doing. I think the West is failing. I think their demise is inevitable. I think China's ascendancy is inevitable. But it seems like Trump gave him a better chance. If he would have tried to peel Russia away from China, aligned with Russia, and then they could have better destabilized China. Fortunately, that wasn't going to happen either. But it seems that the establishment was silly to not allow Trump to do that. But what are your thoughts on that, Jay? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump. I think what I've noticed about U.S. politics is that there's a constant shifting of which country is the main enemy. So the Democrats, their main enemy is Russia, whereas for the Republicans, particularly under the last Trump administration, the main enemy was China. And before Trump, the U.S. had like a kind of long period of friendly relations with China, although the pivot to Asia did begin under Barack Obama. So there's some continuity there. I think what's unique about Trump is that he appealed to those Americans who had been affected by deindustrialization, and he appealed to Americans who wanted to bring industries back to the United States. And so at least his strategy for taking on China was about restructuring the United States. Now, of course, he could never do it to anywhere near he could never do it in a thorough way, and that's just because of the nature of the American capitalist system. He's too constrained. I mean, he tried the whole steel tariff thing, and I think that was maybe partially successful. But you have to kind of commit to these policies for about 10 years or something like that, and you have to take on the American financial oligarchy, which he was unable to do. There was another point that I wanted to raise, which is that about containing Russia. I mean, how I said before that there's this like elite club of countries in Western Europe as a part of it. I mean, yeah. I mean, what did Germany get for joining the United States in this containment of Russia? They got the chance to industrialize. Whereas, Ukraine does not get that. Ukraine is not being treated as a member of the club. So Ukraine actually got a better deal from Russia. I mean, that's the reason why the US had to resort to a coup d'etat against Ukraine back in 2014, because the West and NATO and the European Union could not offer a better deal to Ukraine than what Ukraine was getting from Russia. And so they just resorted to a coup d'etat. They're not going to give Ukraine the kind of Western living standards that they could actually afford with Germany and the Marshall Plan. Ukraine hasn't been given any of that. So the people of Eastern Europe, unfortunately, maybe some of them realize it and others don't. They were simply bought by the cultural propaganda of like America and like rock music and things like that. They did not. I don't think they realized that they would not be treated as members of the club.
Yeah, that was an excellent analysis. Thank you.
That's true. They were treated like a colony, and they're gonna, Ukraine is there to be exploited. We're gonna wring every last drop of blood from Ukraine in order to destabilize Russia. That's their job. Their job isn't to be an equal part of Western Europe. That was never in the cards. In Trump's defense, Trump did tweet that all industries need to leave China. I believe he ordered that in a tweet. So he did his best.
I also want to add one thing is that the current situation in Ukraine also seems to be designed to weaken the European Union too, which all along in NSA in the PNAC report, I think it's 1993, one of the sections talks about weakening the EU, that the EU is a genuine threat to a U.S. economic hegemony. So I think what's occurring now, partially, especially to countries like Germany, and the closing down of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, is to keep Germany, keep the EU and NATO powers subservient to U.S. power. So I just want to toss that in.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Please, Billy.
Oh, one of the key strategic objectives of the U.S. has always been to keep, Russia and Western Europe from getting too closely aligned.
That's what I was going to say.
When Nord Stream 1 was bad enough, but they were not going to allow Nord Stream 2 to be completed, because that would have been it would have been game over, really, and the integration of Russia and Western Europe would have been, it would have been, the U.S. would have been out, right? So by what's going on in Ukraine, U.S. has kept Russia out, and now they're going to try and make Europe dependent on our energy exports, which is not going to be good for Europe at all. They're sacrificing tremendously in our behalf and to Russia's detriment. But Jay, you could probably say what I said, only better. So please.
Everything that you said was great. I fully agree with it. I would also add that if you wanted to have like a crude look of of geopolitics in the 20th century, then you could say that in the first half of the 20th century, Germany and Russia were fighting over Ukraine. Russia ends up winning. After the Second World War, Ukraine was roped into the Soviet Union. But now the situation is different, because Germany and Russia are actually just trying to do business with each other. They're trying to do mutually beneficial trade. And so the United States needs to keep Ukraine destabilized in order to prevent Russia and Germany from doing that trade via, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline.
So what I'd like to ask you then is, since 40% of Western Europe's energy resources come from Russia, and that these are destabilizing forces when people are cold in winter and unable to put gasoline in their cars at a reasonable price. what do you think the consequences will be among the general populations in the EU countries? What do you think? I don't want to put the onus on you.
I think
but what do you think might come about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like eventually there's going to be a Russophilic reaction against the status quo. In the sense that give it one election cycle, the propaganda that's used to justify aggression towards Russia, or keeping the war in Ukraine going by arming the Ukrainians and trying to defeat Russia militarily in Ukraine. Eventually, the will to fight is going to be eroded in Western Europe, simply because their living conditions are going to be smashed, their industries are going to shut down, there's going to be mass unemployment, there's going to be extreme inflation, because they've chosen to essentially sanction themselves by not importing energy from Russia.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that the once again the propaganda machine is kicked in, and they've Russia's recent refusal to send more I think it was natural gas to several countries, a couple of countries. I can't offhand, I can't remember which ones.
Poland or something refused to buy in rubles.
Yeah, the ones who refused to pay their outstanding debt to Russia.
Okay.
But the West is treating it as though it's Russia's fault. But I know from my experience with my electric company, when I didn't pay the bill, they cut my electricity off, and yet this is how desperate the propaganda has gotten, from Madison Avenue, from New York, who's apparently, with what they just did on the Snake Island with the Ukrainian forces that got slaughtered. It seems like all military strategy now is taking place at the level of the PR firms in New York. They're not even militarily logical. So there's a kind of also insanity. I mean, I don't know if you sense it or not, but there's a kind of just wackiness coming out of the West. And when the shit hits the fan, when the cauldron in the Donbass is completed, and the majority of the serious Ukraine forces are wiped off the face of the earth, and it begins to dawn on the West, especially these idiots we have in the United States, and I mean they are idiots. I think there's going to be a kind of mass insanity that goes even beyond the mass insanity we've seen the last 5 or 10 years. If you have any sense of that from your perspective in Australia, which is another wacky, stupid country.
Yes, it is.
Who from my experience in history, those assholes went along with the United States in Vietnam. How stupid can you be? But anyway, what's your point of view from where you're at?
Well, I mean, Australia is a country that has been politically subverted. Can I see you guys, by the way? Like, I'd much rather have like visual feedback.
The producer's in control of that, so thank you.
Right. Yes, thank you to the producer. I'd much rather prefer this.
Gough Whitlam government.
Exactly. I mean,
they overthrew the government because of a listening post in the center of Australia.
That's right.
But anyway,
I mean,
go ahead.
He was he wanted to nationalize.
The U.S. staged a coup against Australia.
Yeah, it was a soft coup. I mean, because in Australia, the head of state actually is not the prime minister and the elected political party of the day, or the political coalition that has the majority in parliament. It's the Queen. So the Queen's representative in Australia, John Kerr, essentially just dismissed the Prime Minister of Australia. And we believe this was simply because of pressure from the CIA, So, you look at countries like Syria, where they've, fought hard to resist regime change. I mean, unfortunately in Australia, because of the kind of the cultural hegemony of the United States and Britain and the English language, Australians at the time in the 1970s didn't respond by asserting their sovereignty. I mean, I think that would have been the time for a civil war, actually, to resolve the question once and for all as to the independence of Australia. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. So Australia, as a result, ever since the 1970s, has just become more and more of a vassal of the United States. It's not capable of asserting its own independent interests. Like even in the Middle East, Australia's interests are simply to export agrarian commodities to Iran, Iraq, and other countries in the Arab world, not to support war against them. That's what Australia's interests are. Australia's interests are to, have normal, peaceful relations with China, because China is our biggest trading partner. Well, China's every country's biggest trading partner now, right? But instead, we've been convinced by the United States that we need to be part of this attempt to aggressively contain China. But why do we have to contain them? I mean, they are our biggest trading partner. We need them, right? And so it's kind of funny because what we actually need with China is protectionism, so that our industries come back. We need to have capital controls so that our capitalists don't invest in China or invest overseas in general, and that we can actually, reindustrialize our economy. We need a national bank, so that we can, just produce our own credit. We can capitalize our own investment banks, fund long-term infrastructure projects instead of, borrowing from the private sector. Those are the things that would actually serve Australia's national interests. But instead, what we get is free trade with China and hostility with China, when what we actually need is the opposite set of priorities, which is we need friendly relations with China and some measure of protectionism. That's what we actually need to serve Australia's national interests.
And I think the same could be said of the United States.
Yeah.
But I think, then we get into class analysis, and, every nation like Germany, like Australia, has a capitalist class and then the working class. And I think the capitalist classes in Germany, in Australia, are more than happy to go along with U.S. dictates, and they're happy to push all the sacrifice onto the working class. So like you said, in Europe, they're going to be pretty cold this winter, but it's not the capitalists aren't going to be cold. It's going to be the working class. And so they're playing a little bit of a dangerous game by putting all the pain onto the working class. It might work in the short term, but that might cause, a backlash. And I hope it does. And, but
we've talked about this, though, Billy. The backlash. The backlash is like a balloon. Pessimistic. You blow up a balloon and you let it go, and it goes. You don't know where it's going to go. We've already seen parts of it with the Europe's and the United States attitude toward immigration, and the racism that defines that. That's the balloon going out of control.
No, that's true.
They're blaming the wrong people. Now I know here in the United States, the idiots we have in this country. The white people, they always blame. They always punch down. They can't punch up. They're afraid to punch up. They're cowards. And so I have no faith. I think when it goes, it blows, and it blows in directions that are ugly and we didn't anticipate. And I don't think they don't touch the elite class, the oligarchs at all. I think there's so much admiration for wealth, at least in the United States, that people will be starving and they'll still be blaming African Americans. That's just the way this stupid country works. But
I reject your pessimism.
There's a reckoning coming. I'm sorry.
Can I just say that I actually think that there is a natural alignment between anti-imperialism and anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, I know that sounds controversial, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the US has this invade and invite attitude to the rest of the world. So the way that it's treated, Latin America over the past century, coup after coup, Guatemala, Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, The attempt is to try and keep these countries poor. So naturally, there's going to be an influx of migration. I know that a lot of it is actually from Mexico, but then you've got Mexican drug cartels there as well, right? I mean, there's a long-standing. Everyone knows about the relationship between the CIA and the drug cartels all across Latin America. This makes life difficult and violent and impoverished for people in Latin America, and so many of them go to the United States to find a better life. And that actually just keeps these countries dependent on remittances from the United States. So in many ways, like the immigration crisis is a part of the American imperialism crisis.
Yeah, I used to do a television show back in the 80s when Reagan was decimating Central America, and our focus was on El Salvador and
Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, thank you.
Yep.
And we would send the raw tape. We would tape demonstrations here to show support for the people in Central America, and we would send the raw tape down there. But even today, and Billy Bob and we're stupid enough to do this. We kibitz with people openly on the internet arguing these points, and the point you just made is so valid, and it was so borne out with our work we did in the 80s that what you do is you destroy a country so much that a percentage of the people want to leave. But all you hear from these idiots is everybody wants to come to America. Well, I point out to them that when they were trying to draft me, there were 37 million people in Vietnam. Now there's almost 100 million people in Vietnam. And I would point out there's only 1.6 million Vietnamese in America. So the vast majority of Vietnamese are still in Vietnam, despite a devastating war from the United States.
Yeah.
So that, and I also point out that the population has grown enormously in Vietnam, and people that are unhappy, they just don't fuck that much, they don't just have children like that. So but you can't, Billy Bob will attest to this. You can't get that through to these pinheads we have in this country. You cannot. He just wasted a whole day, wasted a whole fucking day trying to talk to these idiots. And so did I.
Jay's familiar too, I'm sure. Part of the, when we ruin and destabilize these countries and they come here, that also depresses wages and it makes labor less strong. And so that's also in the interest of the capitalist class. So, it's a win-win-win for them.
Especially now, I think like in the past, the so-called illegal immigration into the United States wasn't as big of a deal because the jobs that that Mexicans would do were the jobs that the American working class wouldn't do because they had better jobs. But what happens when the US industrializes and all of those jobs are no longer there? Then the American working class is competing for the same jobs with all of the immigrants who don't have citizenship, right? That's the thing. I mean, it's what I'm saying. Like anti-imperialism is actually the natural ally of anti-immigrant sentiment. So anti-immigrant sentiment is like straightforward economics. I mean, when you increase the reserve army of labor, wages go down, right? I mean, there's you can't really disagree with that basic principle. I just wanted to add one more thing, which is that I think that there's a tendency, the way that I've defined imperialism before is like, the division of the world into oppressed nations and oppressor nations. There's a tendency for that to dovetail into crude third worldism, which is to say there's the first world and there's the third world, and the first world exploits the third world, and the workers in the first world are just labor aristocrats. But actually, I think what we're seeing is the third worldization of the first world, and vice versa. There's actually kind of like evening out of global relations that's happening. Actually, the US working class does pay for US imperialism in the form of deindustrialization, because by having the world reserve currency, the price that you pay for that as Americans is the deindustrialization of your country. Because if you can just print money and that money is accepted all over the world, then you don't need to build your own capacity to produce things at home. You can just import them from the rest of the world, which then displaces local industry. So the American working class does pay for it in the end.
Yes.
Astute analysis, Jay.
Yes,
thank you for coming on the show. I want to shout out to Dust James. I saw Dust James commenting. That was nice of him to be a viewer this morning. He's got a great show himself.
Yes.
I think we're at the end of our time. I really appreciate Jay staying up or getting up this early and joining us from Australia. Carlo, you have anything to say?
No, but I just want to thank Jay. It was great. Good job. Thank you.
Yeah. Hope to do it again, Jay. I will definitely invite you back soon.
Yep.
Yeah.
And one more thing. If you want lower oil prices, end the war on Yemen.
That's true. Stop the sanctions against Iran and Venezuela as well, and stop the war in Ukraine, and we could have some very competitive energy prices.
That's why that was one of the extensive reasons why Berber was so important to the United States. By the way,
Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, if how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative discussion of financial literacy. With Professor Anthony Rivecchio, your financial problems will be solved.